Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of One Single Story. Today I'm with Pastor Zack Unkenholz and Pastor Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at the book of First Kings. So this year we're going through the themes of each book of the Bible, and today we're looking at First Kings, and the theme for First Kings is that irresponsibility leads to disruption. We begin to see in the book of First Kings, beginning with Solomon, specifically, how just this horrible irresponsibility begins to lead to consequences and causes problems. Solomon seems pretty solid until you get to like chapters 10, 11, 12, and then he feels like he falls off the rocker, Has to be his Ecclesiastes years. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like. But then after him, you have people like Rehoboam, who decides to be harder on the people than his father was, and we'll talk about him a little bit today. Jeroboam makes these golden calves, and the people begin to worship them in chapter 12, and we're going to look at chapters 11 and 12 today. Chapter 15, you have Abijah, Nadab, and Baasha, who do evil in Israel as their kings, but then you have Asa, who's doing right in Judah, and there's this constant battle that goes on between them. In chapter 16, you get more evil kings. Eventually, you get Ahab. So some of these kings are more famous than others, either for good or for bad. Chapter 17, you find Elijah. There's this famine going on, and he's fed by a raven, and then he's fed by this poor widow who believes like this is the last meal she's going to make. Chapter 18, you have the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, which is another kind of Sunday school story. Then you have chapter 19 after this, after Elijah has seen this, he runs from Jezebel like he's afraid for his life. And then 19 is Elisha is called. You have this story of Ahab wanting Naboth's vineyard in 21. And then the book ends with opposing kings. You have Jehoshaphat, who's a good king, and Ahaziah, who's a bad king. Outside of, so we're going to talk about Solomon, Rehoboam, and Jeroboam today a little bit. But outside of those other kings or stories, is there a specific story of irresponsibility in First Kings that sticks out to you that, like, every time you read it, you think this is terrible or sad or bad?
I mean, for me, anything with false gods, like turning to false gods, even when they can see all that God has done, like for them, and they have the histories, like you have like David was not here that long ago, and you could see God working in his life and how he worked, it like helped the people of Israel, and yet for some reason the people continue to turn back to these false gods. They look to other gods for other things, and um, we'll read later on about these two golden calves that are made. But anytime I read that, I just think like it's so twisted how they can keep falling into this kind of stuff and worshiping these false idols, even when it's like you're at a time in history when God is so prevalent. It seems that he's like there and he's speaking to people, and so I think that it's anytime I read that, I'm just like, gosh. But if I was in their place, I might be the same way. I don't know.
The whole ordeal with Naboth and Ahab is one that's like, man, you're a king. You own a lot. You have a lot of things. And this one vineyard makes you so upset and causes all of these problems. And it shows real irresponsibility and real immaturity on Ahab's part to like care about this one piece of land so much that he throws a hissy fit
He
and
can't eat.
right,
Yeah, he's
right,
crying, and
right.
then his wife she's on the other end of the spectrum, like, well, we'll get it,
Right.
So it's I would agree. I see that. I try to identify it in my own life. it's certainly easier to spot in other people's lives.
I see it in my 2-year-old's life a lot.
How good he has it. And
No,
this
I'm just
one
throwing the
little
hissy
thing
fits.
throws him. Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't necessarily mean throwing hissy fits, but how like life is pretty good, but this one little thing, sometimes people will come talk to me and I'll go, that really bothers you? And I don't mean that ugly. I'm like, gosh, I would like to have that problem. I would like that to be the thing that I'm worried about. But sometimes we can become so focused on the things we don't have. Instead, that's the beauty of gratitude.
Mm-hmm.
And it is that when we practice it on a regular basis, it makes us think about the things we do have instead of focusing on the things we don't have. Because if you ever focus on too much on what you don't have, I don't know that you'll throw a hissy fit, but you can certainly, it can change your attitude,
Right.
affect your attitude.
And at least leads to coveting, if not to other sins to get what it is that you think you need.
Yeah, and the price he paid in the end for getting that vineyard, if I remember the story right, because we're not talking about it today, so I'm going off memory. If I remember the story right, he ends up getting buried in that very vineyard or field that he takes. That's what he does. He takes it from Naboth. The whole dynamic to me between Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel is it's an unusual thing to me. There are elements to it that make it even more difficult. Elijah seems to struggle with possibly depression. Like I'm not qualified to put that on people I do know, much less somebody I'm reading about in a book. But we find some pretty dark moments in his life, where he's off by himself going, nobody loves God but me, but he's this powerful, outspoken prophet for God at the same time. And so that dynamic, it's one of those things, like I see people who, I know people who are performers that struggle with depression, anxiety. But if you see them on a stage, like you would have no idea like that was their issue. Because it's like when they're out there, it's like, ooh, they're just got the biggest personality, but then they just go into this shell, that they struggle to function. You have that, then you have Jezebel, who seems to be this conniving, evil human being. That's the way it appears to me. I grew up believing she was bad because she wore makeup. That's what I grew up. Did you grow up believing that, Alyssa?
Probably not as strongly, but I definitely, like, the cartoons would be like blue eyeshadow.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when they made it up a big deal,
I've never heard that before.
Really?
No, about the make. I mean, like, I know, but like,
if in the environment I grew up in, if you heard somebody call somebody else a Jezebel, that's pretty much what they were speaking.
It wasn't because they were like trying to murder people.
No.
Okay.
It had nothing to do with vineyards, and it had everything to do with they wore jewelry and wore lots of makeup.
Well.
Yeah, and but she seems to be this evil, conniving, controlling person, and Ahab doesn't seem to know what he believes. It's like he has moments where he believes in God, and then he has moments where he's being controlled, by his wife, and she's leading him down a bad path. And instead, you speak of the vineyard, like even if he cries and whines, when he finds out what she's done, he should have at least spoken up and said, "You shouldn't have done this." But he doesn't. He doesn't say anything, And so the dynamics between them three, those three people, the way it plays out, because, I would think, maybe y'all see it differently. I would think that if I saw God rain fire down from heaven and burn up everything, that I would have been bold enough to never run again. Like God was going to take care of me. But immediately, that's pretty much what he does when he comes down off the mountain, is he flees from her because she's wanting to kill him. And I think that probably, in my opinion, is the most famous relationship of First Kings, even though we're not going to talk about it. That triad of people, Jezebel, Ahab, and Elijah. When you think of Elijah, what story do you think about most?
Was it Elijah or Elisha with the bears? Was it? I'm trying to remember. Which one was bald? Do you remember? There's a story.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it's Elijah or Elisha, but there's a story about he's walking and all these kids. Do you remember?
It's Elisha.
It's Elisha.
It's in Second Kings. You're not allowed to talk about it.
Oh, sorry. Then I'm not going to talk. No spoilers. That's next week. But yeah, that's one I think of. Elijah. I mean, the one I think of is on the mountain with the prophets of Baal, and he's making fun of them. Calling out to them like that. I think is like that's one of the stories that even in like when we were kids we'd hear about. Even though it's a very dark story, and a lot of people don't even realize that like afterwards like they put all those prophets to death.
Some of those things that were Sunday school stories, either they sanitized them, or I just don't remember them talking about things like that. What I remember is their God didn't answer, my God did, and he burned up the sacrifice. I don't remember there being a lot of conversation. And it's not they put them to death. That's the thing I got last year in the reading was it was Elijah that killed them all. He's a killing prophet, preacher, fire rain downer.
I did get in trouble. So I was teaching God's kids and I told this story and I told the whole story. Okay. I didn't leave anything out. I don't sanitize things. I told the whole story. And then we've got
video evidence.
But we had the kids draw a picture from the story. And one of the kids, there was a lot of red on the page. And then I had to talk to those parents. But that was, so... Well, I mean, for the youth, I can tell them the story. But with God's kids, don't worry if I'm ever teaching little kids, like, I won't tell the whole story. I won't share that part,
I won't tell the whole story.
And God won. And that's it. That's the end.
Yeah, out of all the things to sanitize, I remember a lead pastor who was teaching at a VBS. And he decided to sanitize the story of David having a chance to kill Saul. And instead of that David was relieving himself in a cave. Or no, Saul was relieving himself in a cave. He said Saul was sleeping. It's like, out of all the things you're going to sanitize, you're going to sanitize the fact that that the king was pooping in a cave.
Yeah,
This makes it fun.
So that causes me to want to ask a question. Like, I think it's not podcast relevant, but it is relevant. When in the context of children, you work with youth, you have children, and Tyler's teaching your kids Greek and Hebrew by this point. So I could, I'm laughing because last Wednesday night from recording this, Judah come out talking about the lesson and Tyler's head starts twitching. He's like, we're going to have to talk about this in context when we get home. It was cracking me up. But are there contexts? So you work with youth, you have kids, I have grandkids. We have a children's ministry here. Are there contexts where you should only teach a piece of the story? You should leave certain things out for their ability to comprehend it or for their own mental health, and then later allow them to learn it. For example, like I said, I don't remember Elijah killing all 400 of the prophets or ever how many there were of Baal. When I read it last year, I wasn't mad that nobody had taught that to me. And I also thought that if Zack had been my teacher, how devastating that might have been to think about the bloody mess that ensued after that. I'm just curious. That's just it's really not a First Kings question. It's just an opinion question.
So I was going to say, so last week, Olive asked a question about, and this is a pretty deep question for a kid to ask, was God lonely before he created people? That was like what she was asking. Was God like alone? Was he lonely? And I started to explain it like, well, he didn't create us out of need. He didn't like, she is 3, by the way. So I don't know why I decided to get super deeply theological, but I was like, well, God didn't need us, but God wanted us. Like he created us and he wanted to love us. He didn't create us out of need, and he doesn't need us, but he still loves us. And then I was saying how, but God, before even we were created, the Godhead 3 in 1, the Trinity. God lived in perfect harmony with himself. And so he didn't, and then clearly your eyes just glossed over. And I realized, why am I trying to explain this to a kid? I'm like, she's 3 years old. And I was like,
Blippi now?
Yes, no, we're going to go watch Blippi or Miss Rachel. But that was the thing is like, I realized, I don't need to go into all of that. And I think that too, there are times even I have some students who are like have grown up in church, and I can have deep conversations with them and they can ask me some deeper questions. And there are some students who they might be in high school, but like they're very new to church. Like they might have only been coming for a few months. And so there's some things that are very, very new to them. And so the way I talk to them, there are some things that if I go into too many of the details, or if I even tell certain stories before they have an understanding of God to a certain degree, it can really like shake them a lot. Eventually we do have to talk about those things. You can't just forever go without talking about like the wrath of God, for instance. The wrath of God is a part of God. Like that is, you can't deny that. But if you just go into it only talking about the wrath of God and they don't understand that God loves us, and that he has a just wrath, then that could scare some people. So I think you do sometimes have to be selective, but you can't forever be that way. Eventually you have to talk about sin. You got to talk about God's wrath. You've got to talk about the whole picture, or else they're not going to get a real understanding of who God is.
Yeah, I'm grateful that for all the teachers I had as I was growing up. And I think that I'm trying to think of sanitized stories that I've heard. I don't feel like it was sanitized for any level of kid. I think that if it wasn't appropriate, they just didn't teach that whole story. And I that's where I would fall, where if the story is not appropriate to tell and it's fairly full context, you probably just need to wait for that story. I don't like the idea of changing the details to make them more palatable.
Mm-hmm. I don't know about changing the details, just leaving pieces out.
But that's where I would land. If it needs to wait, it can wait. That story, there's plenty of stories about Jesus that these kids need to learn as a foundation before they can kind of fill in those gaps, like you were saying.
So I just remembered one other thing, really quick story. I went to go see one of my students, Caroline. They were doing a play, and they did part of the play. They did the story of Esther, and I had Olive with me. I took her with me because all these Bible stories, and they show Haman being hanged. Like they actually have a body being hanged on stage, and like immediately I pull out my phone and start showing her some of the Cheerwine videos we made because I was like, "Holy cow, they're really gonna hang him right now!" And they pull him up, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" The show was great. I will say that I enjoyed it, and Caroline did a wonderful job. But yeah, I was like, "Yeah, it's pretty dark." It's like normally we tell the story of Esther, we don't include that part when we're telling kids, but that's a very common story we talk with kids about.
All right, well, let's transition over and talk about the text that we have today, which is 1 Kings 11 and 12, and look at some of the theological implications that we can take away from this story. So the story, there's multiple stories that we find in chapter 11 and 12. And what has happened is Solomon has deviated from the path that God has told him. and God has said that he's going to tear the kingdom apart, and separate it into two. But he's not going to do it in Solomon's lifetime. It's going to be done through his heirs. Why do you think God would wait to put the full punishment on Solomon's descendants instead of Solomon having to watch it?
I think somewhere, and I don't remember where, but I think somewhere it does say that God showed mercy on Solomon because he was David's son. So it was like because of God's love for David, he spared Solomon of this. But grandkids, that's it, you're no longer loved now. But it's just like, I can't remember where that text is though, because I feel like I do remember reading that very recently. But
Well, it says, "For the sake of your father, David, I will not do this while you are still alive. I will take the kingdom away from your son."
Why do you think that's why God would do it?
I think God likes to work within the natural world a lot and create things that can kind of situations that will naturally evolve. And so maybe that was one of the ways that, it was later in his life. In order to create that disruption, it would have had to be something quite catastrophic where a natural place for disruption is when there is a changeover of leadership. Whenever there's a changeover in leadership in church, growing up, there'd be families that would come back who had left and families who would leave immediately when that pastor would leave. And so a change of leadership is a natural kind of disruption time, no matter what. And that's just how life goes. I think I was editing one of our podcasts and we were all talking about how we've messed up our kids. Like, things we do affect our kids, our families, those around us. And that's how life rolls.
Yeah. It's, I would say it would have also been more difficult. Solomon had such influence that it would have been extremely difficult to have overtaken him and what he had built, or to get another king to turn against him. He just had such massive influence, and tackling someone who was a newbie, at the beginning. Maybe this is it's weird that Solomon asked for wisdom. Did God's wisdom run out? Did it leak?
It's like pixie dust,
Did it wear off?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just curious. It seems like, let me say it like this, and I don't know, this is probably a part of a practical application, but it seems like the older you get, the wiser you should get. It seems like the older he got, the less wise he became.
Yeah, like he used up all his wisdom
right
early on. But even the story of his great wisdom of "I will cut the baby in two" is that such great wisdom? And so I think the wisdom of Solomon, almost the whole point of it is that anything that man does, he needs God. And so we need God. Even some of the best kings in there had their things that trip them up because we need Jesus.
I know people that I would consider wise who make bad mistakes or bad choices out of arrogance. And I think that's like what we see here too, is that like maybe he relies on his own wisdom instead of relying on God. He relies on his wives versus God. And there's a lot of things that you can see that maybe he does still have that wisdom, that because God is still there, God is still with him. But the older he gets, it seems that, yes, as people get wiser as they get older. It seems that as he gets older, less and less is he relying on God and looking to God.
Wisdom isn't perfection, so you expect him to make mistakes. That's not the level I hold him to. But it's like, the older he got, the worse it became, We even find this, and probably, I think it's in the book of 1 Kings, maybe Asa. And now I'm getting ready to get in where I don't have any business, but it seems like the older he got, the more he turns, he at the end of his life, he's turning away from God instead of turning to God. But in verse 14, it says, God raised up an adversary for Solomon. As a matter of fact, he raises up 3 adversaries. How do you feel about this? What does it say about God to you? Like when you think, okay, because automatically I hear people will say, God doesn't tempt people with evil. He only prompts people to do good. But there are some troubling passages in Scripture. He hardens Pharaoh's heart. He raises up adversaries for.
He makes his prophets lie
right
in this book.
Yeah, So tell me, what can we derive about God when we read things like this that seem to be opposite of what we believe about God?
I think even in my own life, I feel like God has brought up adversaries to me, and that is like, and those have been. I don't understand God's plan necessarily. I don't pretend to know what He's planning or what He's doing, and we don't understand how He's going about doing things. But I've had people who have hurt me, gone against me, challenged me in some ways, but that have made me better coming out of it, or later down the line, I could see, okay, I can see what God was doing there now, but I couldn't see it in the moment when I was at war with these people or fighting with somebody. But and in Scripture too, there is a purpose. The benefit of Scripture is that we can kind of see the bigger picture, looking back and be like, okay, you can see God had purposes in this, or this was essentially the carrying out of God's justice later on. But it can be kind of troubling. Sometimes you're thinking, oh man, like, is this how God normally operates? Is this how he does things?
So let me look, just before we get away from that. Did the people who were your adversaries act with integrity, do the right thing, be honest?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
I would say so.
So you believe God raises up people to do evil?
I think that, well, an adversary, maybe I'm thinking of this. Well, I guess like, I wouldn't say those people are necessarily, I mean, I guess everyone's evil. We all sin, we all fall short. But I don't think those people are necessarily like evil. Like God wasn't like, all right, boom, you're evil, now go hurt Zack.
Maybe evil is a strong word, but like I would assume you saw them as either manipulative or dishonest or untrustworthy. But you believe God raised them up in your life. So I'm just curious. Because I think this is a troubling piece to this story. Do you believe God raised up troublemakers, dishonest people?
I think sometimes He did. I mean, we see it in a few places in Scripture. I think, I can think of people in my past that like they're troublesome people, troublemakers that were in my life that hurt a lot of people, and when you look at that, you can think, how is God working in that? But like, I wouldn't be where I am today without those troublemakers being raised to where they were, or being where they were. And so, and other things, and now even you can look and see like other things falling into place that when you're in it, it's like, what is God doing in this? Like, why would God allow this to happen? But looking back, it's like, okay, I see there's a purpose in it. Maybe you don't like how God carried it out or how he used people. Like we read about Nebuchadnezzar. God used Nebuchadnezzar in a lot of ways, and he was not a good guy. A lot of these kings are not necessarily good people. Even Solomon, like, he had a good start, but did not finish very strong. But God was still able to use them in the good things He did, and even use the bad things. And I do question sometimes, like I question sometimes the things that are going on, but I don't question God. Like I know He is much wiser than I am, that He's got a plan in all of it. But it can be difficult when you're in the middle of it or when you're facing that adversity.
Solomon had abandoned what all the different gods, the Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Scythians. Like, he didn't even just choose one religion. He was just like, I'm gonna do them all because they all sound good. And this wife likes this one, so I'll build her an altar, and I'll go worship with her on this day or whatever. So I think God was trying to protect his people partially, protect his people from these outside influences. And so there needed to be somebody to go against the king who was bringing in all of these horrible influences into Israel.
But do you believe they were fighting him to bring good to the country, or it was just God's way of trying to get his attention?
Their purposes were not, I'm going to bring you back to fidelity with your God, but
God's purposes.
But I think God's purposes will win out in the end.
Yeah, this is the troubling piece to me is about situations like this. And, Judas is another one. He's born for this one job, is that it does lead and can lead and certainly deserves a discussion about. And I think the word would be universalism, maybe, where that maybe not the right word, where everybody's in, like we're just all being used by God right now for different purposes. But in the end, we all arrive in the same place, I certainly don't hold that position. Mm-hmm. I just know that when you start down this path, okay, God uses these evil people and they're born and this is their purpose. Why don't they make it? The Calvinist view would be the opposite. Some are chosen for eternal punishment. Some are chosen for, eternal reward. And these are just the ones that are chosen for eternal punishment. And God's using, ones that are going to go to eternal punishment no matter what, I would say that's probably more where not how you believe. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but where you would have come from.
And I probably, in a lot of my thoughts, I probably would have leaned towards that definitely growing up. And even still, there's some, I'm not sure. I don't have all the answers, so I can't say oh yeah, I believe this or I believe that. I'm still learning. I mean,
so my position there is that I'm not comfortable with either one. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm really torn, but I would be more comfortable saying, okay, some are just doomed for eternal damnation, and God's allowing them to be used to bring about His purposes in the good, than to say God is causing this person to do evil, mm-hmm. or to do wrong or to do bad, so that He can bring about His good. Because then that challenges my view of the character of God as being holy and perfect. How can a holy God cause people to do things that are unholy? So that becomes the tension for me. And that's at both extremes. The extreme that says some people are just doomed from birth, created to die and go to eternal torment. Everybody's going to make it. Those are both, from my position, at least the way I see it. But I don't know that there's a good answer here. Because it really, if you can read this, and it doesn't make you pause and think, you're not reading. That's the way whether you have an answer or not, whether you even have a good answer or not is one thing. But when you just read over it and say, don't give it any consideration, I think that's dangerous.
The Bible is a better conversation starter than it is. The Bible says that I believe it. That's it.
Right.
That's what I think one of the biggest things we did from all of these Bible discussions we've had, where we've had to dive into scripture that doesn't get talked about on a regular Sunday morning, is these are great places to start and to dive in. But man, to take theology from one verse is dangerous.
And even this year I preached a passage about if you choose a king that I've never preached before. I don't even know that I've ever had a conversation about it. And by the time you hear this podcast, I will have preached another text. I've preached on Deborah before, but I'd never preached on, JL driving the spike through the guy's forehead. I've never
that's
preached
my favorite.
on that.
That's probably my favorite story in the Bible.
I can see that. How many times have you wanted to drive a stake through my head? Oh, less than a dozen?
Sure.
Okay. See, I was trying to bail you out.
Oh, man.
So when you get to verse 29, Ahijah, who is this prophet, runs into Jeroboam, and he takes his cloak and he cuts it, or rips it, it says, into 12 pieces, and he gives 10 to Jeroboam, which seems to signify you're going to oversee 10 of the tribes. There's going to be 2 left, in another tribe. There are people who make a living talking about numbers in the Bible. As a matter of fact, I think it's called numerology. It's got a name, I don't think you can ignore numbers in the Bible. They have significance. I'm just curious, how important do you think numbers are? And are you able to, what's the word? See things that might imply something broader at times, because I hear people say, like, 7 is the number of completion, I'm just curious what your theories or thoughts are about numbers.
I see numbers a little bit more like the symphony that accompanies a movie score. Like, it gives you an idea of what's going on. It tells you, oh, Vader is coming if that music starts playing. And I know you don't even know who Vader is.
I do.
But
I know who Vader is.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh.
Yeah.
I know he's never seen Star Wars, but
No,
would be
I'm not,
ridiculous.
Yeah.
But so the music gives it, the numbers give you like an idea of, like, it connects it very loosely to these other ideas, but making too much of the numbers sends you down a path of basic astrology. Like, you're just trying to pull things out and make
You're overemphasizing.
right. Right. So it's a thread. It gives us, like, the number of 7 being completion and perfection, and, like, there's a lot of things. I mean, we see numbers throughout the Bible. They're there, but yeah, when you know what the numbers mean, it does help bring a different depth to the story.
Yeah.
But we're not counting Hebrew letters to say, like, doing crossword puzzles in the Hebrew to be like, this is the Bible code, and look at it. It showed that 9/11 was going to happen and things like that.
So on that, I recently just looked at, because I was like, when reading for this, I looked up numerology in scripture, and I watched a YouTube video. I watched a few, like maybe 2 minutes before I realized, oh, this is for crazy people. And you can see it in the comments.
I'm sorry.
Like,
I just spiked the sound.
But it's just like, and just reading the comments, like, I took the letters of Lamb of God, and if you add all the letters together, if you put one letter to, like, a number, like A is 1, you do this, then you subtract 50, then you add, and then you multiply by 6. I'm like, what is happening? I'm reading the comment, I'm like, this is, like, ridiculous. And at the end, it's like, it gets to the number 133,000, which is probably the year the world is going to end, in 133,000. Like, what is it even saying? I was trying to understand the comments. I'm like, this is just ridiculous. Like, and the video is just, like, very goofy. And so, yes, I think that numbers are very important to God. You can see that throughout Scripture. The number 7 is used a lot. The Trinity 3, like, there, like 3 days. There are so many, like,
40.
40 days. Like, there are so many 40. Like, there are some numbers that clearly, like, there's a purpose to them, and when you hear it, like you were saying, it's like, oh man, like, something big's going to happen. Something really important is going to happen in Scripture. God's about to do something.
What are some of those numbers? So you said 40. 7 is obviously, so 7 is a creation. We see 7 at Jericho. 3 seems to be fairly important. Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the whale. Jesus is 3 nights in the heart of the earth. What are some other numbers? Maybe, or 12 is a number usually associated with the 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel. We find commonalities that, the way I would describe it, is often the numbers tie things between the Old Testament and the New Testament, so that you can see some of the symbolism.
Yeah, there's a lot of places, and the ones you mentioned are the ones that you see the most, but there are some, like 10, for instance, here. 1 is used there. I mean, like, the God had 3 in 1. The 10? Well, 10 here, it was just like the 10 cloths, right? But then 2 are taken, and then the 8 that are 8. Do I have math right?
No.
Wait,
No,
wait
you
a second.
don't.
How many cloths was it?
12.
There were
Oh, it was
12.
12
12.
tribes.
But 10 are
We have
given.
the 10 tribes of Israel.
Yeah, that's
We
to the-
forgot
They just
2 of them.
vanished. Where did they go?
That's right.
Yes.
They disappeared.
But yes, it's 12. But then, yeah, I think that I don't pretend I'm very bad at math. It puts me to sleep. But in terms of scripture, like you can tell that numbers are very important to God. There's a reason for them. I don't pretend to understand always, but sometimes like this, it's clearly laid out, And later on, you see when 10 of the tribes leave and only 2 stay, Judah and which was the other one that stayed? I'm trying to remember right now. 2 of the tribes stayed. The 10 abandoned them.
Those are the numbers I can think of off the top of my head. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, 12, 7, 3, 40
777.
are the most common ones. I mean, there are other important numbers, but it's like anything else.
Mhm.
You can make an idol out of it. You can get distracted. I heard but you also can't ignore it. And like I heard a preacher this past week, and he was talking about, you people believe that the Bible is the only word of God. He said, when you hold the Bible up to that, that God doesn't speak anymore, you've made an idol out of it.
You're back on social media, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Bibliolatry, he said,
Yeah.
But the point that is true. If you can make an idol out of the Bible, 100%, he's right. But you can't say that in order for you to say something that is not biblical.
Yes,
right?
yes.
You can't do that, okay? And you can't ignore numbers, right? But you also can't make an idol out of the numbers and think like the numbers are the solution to all biblical prophecy. They're not,
Right.
It's too much. So in chapter 12, it says 3 days later, chapter 12, verse 12, 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to hear Rehoboam's decision, just as the king had ordered. But Rehoboam spoke harshly to the people, for he had rejected the advice of the older counselors and followed the counsel of his younger advisors. He told the people, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I'll beat you with scorpions. So the king paid no attention to the people. This turn of events was the will of the Lord, for it fulfilled the Lord's message to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through the prophet Abijah from Shiloh. It says it was the Lord's will that he didn't listen. Talk to me about this. Like, this is another piece to that. God's will is being disobedient. I don't know.
I don't know if I would call this disobedience.
Ignorance. Certainly ignorance.
Yeah, ignorance. A bad decision is probably the lightest way to put it, that he caused all of these problems, because, I mean, he didn't kick the people out. He just said, I'm going to not relieve the burden that has been placed on you. I'm going to make it harder. Yeah, I think that goes back to raising up an adversary, the lying prophets, like all of that, where we're never going to fully understand God on this side of heaven. And I feel like that might be a cop-out, but
I will also take that cop-out. No, but I think that it's...
I'll take a cop-out for 200.
I'll buy an L. But I think it's... With that, though, I think that God, like we were saying before, his plan, we can't fully understand it. I do think that God's plan works with... I mean, like, God knew we were going to sin. Like, I think like God knows we're going to sin. God knows we're going to fall short. And part of his plan, I mean, like, in order for what he told them was going to happen, because God keeps his promises, what he told them was going to happen in the next generation. In order for that to happen, he had to sin. He had to either sin or be ignorant, whatever you may call it. He had to do that. Do I think God like forced him to not listen? I think it's just his human nature that led that to happen. I think it's only by God's grace that we do anything good, really, that we're able to do the right thing. But I do think that in here, God's grace, he kept it from that situation. I think it's just that God allowed him to do what would lead to what God said was going to happen. Um, I think it just naturally carried out, and it was God's will, and that it's part of His plan that He allowed it to happen.
All right, well, let's take a few minutes and talk about some of the practical applications that we can learn from this story today. All right, so let's take a look at some of the practical applications, some things maybe that we can learn from this story. When you get, it begins about God raising up these adversaries for Solomon. And in verse, it says, when the news reached Hadad of Egypt that David and his commander Joab both were dead, he said to Pharaoh, let me return to my own country. Why, Pharaoh asked, what do you lack here that makes you want to go home? Nothing, he replied, but even so, please let me return home. What causes us to want to go home, to what feels comfortable, to be with our people? What is that longing, no matter how long we've been gone?
Well, I guess even like when we're on vacation, vacations can be very nice. For some people, it can be stressful, but like even though you might have like all expenses paid, you've got great food and you're on a cruise, like even if they were to offer you another week, it's like it's just there's just something nice about being home, the comforts of being home, the people that you know and love are there. There's just something that there's something nice about being home, that comfort that you can't get anywhere else, even if you had every other comfort you could possibly want. It's there's just something special about it.
I agree that there's when you're raised in a certain way, no matter how it is, that's what you find to be normal. And so then when you go back to that normalcy, it's almost like you can breathe a little bit easier when you understand the implications of like does bless your heart mean something nice or not here? There's just like, that's why like third culture kids have such a hard time. So third culture kids would be like children of missionaries who were from the United States and they're living in another country. They kind of never feel like they're at home because they were raised by parents who brought the American ideas into their home. That's perfectly fine. They were raised in a culture where there was not American ideas, which is perfectly fine. But then when they're trying to meld those together, they have a very hard time fitting in anywhere and feeling comfortable anywhere because they have this very unique culture that's only in their house.
Yeah, I have heard people try to make the case, that interracial marriage is a sin, which is impossible to make scripturally. But the thing I've always tried to tell people is it's not a right or wrong. This is not a right or wrong conversation. What you just need to understand is that you're probably coming from a different culture than the other person's coming from, significantly different. And then you're going to have some culture shock, and they're going to have some culture shock. And blending those two cultures is a challenge. And this desire that, man, I would really like to have a slight bit of normalcy in my life. What feels like normal? It's not that it is normal. It's normal. Everybody has their own normal. And I do think, like, for me, like I see it in times that there's a certain camaraderie I have with other pastors, particularly lead pastors, who might have some of the same challenges that I have. And, you find that closeness. I've lived east of Interstate 95 all but 9 months of my life. Like, so Eastern North Carolina, and I've lived north to south. So I've lived the entire coast of North Carolina, but there's a certain culture in northeastern North Carolina that's not in southeastern North Carolina, and there's a certain culture here that you don't find like at the Outer Banks. It's a different vibe, you know. And I think there is this pull, this constant pull to want to be with people that we find some level of comfort with. You know, it's much like coming to church. I think there is a certain level of comfort when we get with people who are similar to us, like us. And I don't think you ever grow out of it, you know. And sometimes, though, I would say our memories are faulty and we remember it much better than it used to be, you know.
Yeah.
That-
I've been away from home for as long as I lived there at this point, pretty much.
Right.
And you go back and you expect everything to be the same because you weren't there for the small changes, and you're like, oh my goodness, when did this happen?
Mhm.
You know, and sometimes things are better and then other things are worse. And
Right.
you just, yeah, it's a little bit of culture shock to go back to your own culture after you've been away for a while.
So Rehoboam in this story becomes king, and the dilemma he has, he asks his dad's advisors, the older guys, what should I do? And they said, you know, if you'll just lighten the load a little bit, the people will love you. And so he goes and asks his friends, his posse.
The bros.
Yeah, what should I do? And they're like, no, you should make it even harder. Don't cut them any slack. And he chooses to make it more difficult for the people, which seems to be like a ridiculously dumb move, you know. Just the slightest bit of goodwill can change, you know, how people view you. He doesn't seem to have any of the wisdom of his father. Why? Why do you believe that's the case?
His father used it all up, like we talked about before.
Yeah.
There was none left, you know.
Is that what's wrong with the world today? Solomon used all the wisdom.
It's all been used up. Yeah.
And as we were talking about, like, even Solomon's wisdom wasn't very wise. And at the end of his days, he had fallen to all of these false gods. And so I think that would have been what his last impression of his father was all of this kind of confusion and, oh yeah, just go worship whatever, or, you know, kind of whatever was going on was fine. And so that was what he left him with. And even though maybe when Rehoboam was younger, there was some wise decisions, you know, he got left with a very bad situation.
Yeah, and I think what we see impacts. So I'll just describe it in my life. I think I benefit significantly from the challenges my dad had to face. Like he had it very, very difficult working through the pastoral ranks and pastoring. It was a challenge. And lots of issues that he had to work through. And I watched all of those like up close and personal. You know, I watched him when he worked and pastored, you know, when he had to do that. And, I just saw so many pieces. My kids have seen some of that, but not all of that. Like they've had it much easier than I did and haven't necessarily seen some of the same leadership challenges up close and personal that I did. My grandkids think I'm made out of money, you know, and like everything is easy. Just, Poppy, can we, give me, you know, whatever. Like they see none of that, none of those inner workings and challenges, you know. When I was younger, when I put in enormous amounts of hours and was gone all the time, they see none of that. You know, I've got time to do with them what I need to get done. And I worry about that for them because I think they're going to assume that everything just comes so easily. I think I benefit from watching difficult life. And one of the challenges of wealth and power for the second generation, it's not true of earned money, like people who come up through the ranks. It takes a few generations after that. But if you are born into wealth, and Solomon was born into wealth, his dad's like, here's a few $1 billion, like
Right.
build the temple.
I think we did the math last
Right.
year.
And he, here, have it, do what you want to. In the beginning, he seems to handle it pretty well. In the end, it becomes his demise. And Rehoboam is watching that. Like, he's not seen any of the struggles, the stress, and the only example he's had with his dad later in life is not wise. It's just stupidity. Mm-hmm. And so I just don't think, I think he's a product of his circumstance. Like, I think you said, Alyssa, had he seen some of those earlier wiser decisions, maybe it has an impact on him, but I just don't think that's the case. We don't know the age either. We might have some guess, right, but it's very possible that he's born later to a younger wife, and I don't know.
Wouldn't it have been the oldest, most likely?
Yeah, most likely. But even in David's case, I don't think the oldest becomes the king.
Bathsheba pulled some strings to get her son.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking too, just like with parenting in general, I think that when we see our parents do something that we don't agree with, I think when we have the opportunity to parent, or when we're adults, then a lot of times we tend to swing the complete opposite way. The advisors that guided Solomon in his later years, like Solomon, a lot of what he did was people pleasing, with making all these false idols and things like that. And maybe his thought was, well, I'm done people. From hearing from his friends, like, I'm done people pleasing because, like, look what people pleasing got us, all these false idols, and now God's upset with us. That could have been one of the reasons why he swung in the other direction. I'm more inclined to believe that's just because he was listening to the bros, and just like he just listened to his friends. But I could understand maybe his reasoning there, and that, like, how wise could my father's advisors even be if they got us into this mess, So
when is the right time to listen to young advice versus seasoned advice?
Never listen to young advice. Just never. It's I'm just joking. But
I'll go ahead and listen. I would give you some examples where I would choose young over old.
There's lots of times where I don't think it needs to be only going with the old advice or only going with the young advice. Now, there was no in between, really. I guess maybe to say to do nothing would be the in between, but that wasn't really an option. I think if you're doing something that, like in our case, like if we're trying to reach the youths of America, we would listen to the youths of our staff, aka Zack. We would be like, what does a youth need? What does a youth group need? We need to trust the people who are there. If we're asking about other situations, there's other people we need to. Every generation kind of brings its own gifts, and you need to know what that generation can bring to the table and when to listen to that generation, and when it's like, what, this is something that that some age would bring some wisdom to.
I saw a meme the other day about like how the importance of having like a millennial on your team as a church branding. But it was just kind of funny because it was a church. They had these.
Do you still count as a millennial?
I am at the very cusp. I have no idea because, like, I have TikTok, but I also love Lizzie McGuire.
Have TikTok. Yeah,
well, I guess you do too. I guess that's true.
That can't be a marker.
Yeah. I can dab. But I'm also a dad, so I guess that
I thought you're a mama.
Mama. I'm the youth group mom. But
that's on his sweatshirt for anyone listening.
Yes. Oh yeah, if you're listening, I'm wearing a sweatshirt that says "Mama" on it. I'm the youth group mama. Anyways, but what were we talking about? Gosh, I get so lost. Yeah. What were we talking about?
You were dabbing.
Oh yes. So there's a church and they have these 3 banners. And one says like worship, the next one says theology, and the last one says faithfulness.
That has nothing to do with
Well, it does have, because
No. Anybody with their right mind would not have put those banners in that order.
I don't think my mom would have thought that if she saw those.
Yeah,
banners.
but
I don't think my parents
I'm
would have
55.
either.
I would have thought.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw it, and the first thing I thought was,
How could you? Yes. Well, because it's, for anyone who doesn't catch on, it says WTF in big letters on
go
the
ahead
top
and tell
of
them
it.
what WTF is, since you decided to use this as a.
What the fudge? Okay.
I'm still gonna bleep that out and make
But
it
the
sound
F
like
is
you
no. Don't bleep this. Oh my god! All I said was fudge, and don't bleep that as well. I'm already in so much trouble with so many people.
So
Don't do this
now. So I don't. I guess maybe that could have been put to.
If you had some people around the table helping to make that decision,
Yeah,
maybe
I would agree 100%. That was a solo decision.
I believe so too.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what age they were. It was definitely a solo decision. I think that the challenge, young is not always stupid. Old is not always wise. That's something we have to make sure we understand. Discernment is critical, because sometimes people can give you advice that sounds good, but it's just bad advice. There are times I'm more interested in people's experience, background, knowledge, understanding, and than I am how old they are. You know, I don't really care if somebody thinks like I do, because as a matter of fact, my natural tendency is, if you think this way, I'm just going to try to think the other way, so we can have a conversation here and not get sucked into this deep hole. But there are times when I think young over old automatically. I typically will hire young over old, typically, not always, but typically that's going to be my default. And my reasoning for that is I would rather train new habits than break old ones. Like, they can, in the church world, they can get entrenched really quick. But surgery, like if I was going to have surgery, I would want a young surgeon.
You would want a young surgeon.
I would want a young surgeon. And there are multiple reasons. One, I think you could talk about practical things, like their hands are probably more steady. But the thing that when I talk to people in the medical profession, that they will tell you is that younger doctors are willing to try newer technologies, where older doctors get set in their ways and they've got to do it a particular kind of way. My son he's had 2 ACL surgeries. And the first time it was an older doctor and he did it a particular way. And 12 months later, it gave away. The new doctor tried it a newer way, using a different method that the older doctor wouldn't. And it's been fine since then. And so I think sometimes it's circumstantial. You don't go to old people and ask them about youth ministry. There are times I will have something to say like about youth ministry, but I don't like Cheryl. I don't talk about youth ministry and children's ministry much, because it just ain't my
You're old
thing. It's just not my thing, you know. And I talk to Alyssa a lot, because I have I stay enveloped in technology reasonable amount, not and just kind of that direction. That's more my bent. I can have more input about music, that because I have certain talents and abilities there. But there are some things I just stay out of. And I don't care how old somebody is or how young somebody is. If they don't have any knowledge of that situation, you probably should avoid trying to seek their wisdom. And I believe that this is only in the way I view this story. I believe that the older men were more concerned about the betterment of the people in the country. The younger guys were more concerned about their own enrichment and power. And that was the downfall in the conversation, in my opinion, that happens. What happens when we get too many people who are just alike? on a decision-making group? In your personal life, staff, leadership?
I know at my last church, we had like general staff meetings that everyone would go to, but then we had like decision-making meetings that I wasn't allowed to go to because I worked in youth ministry. And so it was only it was and even though the person who worked in children's ministry was allowed to because she was older than me. She was in her 40s, and because they thought I was a teenager. I'm in my 20s, okay? I'm not a teenager. I'm not one of the youth. But that was kind of like, and sometimes there were decisions that I was like, I would not have made that decision, or I wish I had some input, but I knew that my input was not valued as much as someone who had been in ministry for longer than me, and I can understand like it's good to have people who have been through it, and they can understand these things well. But I think that having a wide variety of voices around the table, ethnically, age-wise, those things, I think it can help you greatly by having a wide variety of people around the table. Sometimes it's hard to make a decision when you have like 50 people and you're trying to get them all to make the same decision, but having the input of a lot of people from different generations, I think that's it. It can only help you to get a better picture and understanding of what you're trying to make a decision on.
I mean, in our staff, we have people from a lot of different states and a lot of different ages. And I think that has been a benefit to all of us to be able to hear from different perspectives. It helps. Now, the issue becomes, like you said, when there's so many different voices and there has to be a decision maker still. And that's kind of the catch, is when sometimes if you have too many voices that disagree or see things a little bit differently, it can get tricky. But generally speaking, having people who are like-minded just kind of becomes a echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
It's what happens when you follow all the people you like with your
Social
political whatever leanings on social media. It becomes just kind of reinforces anything you think, and if a bad piece of information gets into that community, then you just assume it's true because everyone believes this, everyone knows this, right?
We're all just alike,
right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So let me ask a couple of other questions, and then we'll kind of wind this down. There's this, when you get to the end here, there's this inference that the people don't remember the story of God rescuing them from Egypt. There's either they don't remember or they don't care. Alyssa in the notes mentioned the Mandela effect, where there becomes this mass collective confusion, and you might want to enlighten people on the Mandela effect.
What is the Mandela effect?
Oh, goodness, I should have come with examples, but there are, like, I've seen it a lot in like pop culture where it's like everyone thinks that a certain word is spelled a certain way, and then like you go back and look at it and it's not, and you assume that like at some point they've changed their branding and they've changed their spelling, but no, you cannot find this, even though everyone online thinks that is what it is. And it's, man, I've seen it with like a certain opening for Disney, like the Disney TV shows.
Oh, with like Tinkerbell?
With Tinkerbell.
Yes. Yeah.
And like people can almost picture it in their mind, and they're like, no, this exists. And you have people going through every single VHS and you can't find it because it's just some idea got into people's heads, and I don't know. And that's what it feels like here, is that people just kind of forgot, or like all decided that the golden calves didn't play a huge part in their earlier history. I don't know what the answer is there.
Yeah. Well, even like with like the Mandela effect, it comes from Nelson Mandela. Everyone thought he had died in prison, but then years later, released, and everyone's like, "Wait, he's alive!" Like, and like it was like a shock to like most of culture. People were like, they couldn't believe it, and that's why they call it the Mandela effect, is because Nelson.
See, I don't
Mandela.
ever remember thinking he was dead.
Okay, and I thought he was, and my parents did, and so it was just kind of like, so a lot of people thought he was. That's what the name
He
comes
might
from.
have
But
been dead before you were old enough to know he was dead.
well, I know Nelson Mandela though, but like, and I'm not that young, but I still remember some things. The one I think of is the Berenstein versus the Berenstain Bears. I always thought it was Berenstein Bears, but it's Berenstain
See,
Bears.
Looney Tunes,
Oh, yeah.
how's tunes spelled?
Yes.
Toons or
Yes.
Tunes.
There are a lot of different ones, but here in scripture though too, it's like it could have been that like, whoa, like, because I remember there being a golden calf after that, right? Yeah, there was a golden calf after that. There was a golden calf, but that was not. They were worshiping the golden calf when he came down from the mountain. That was not right, and maybe somehow like things got crossed or whatever, and they got confused, or like you said, it could just be like just a willing belief of like someone just spread something. It's like, yeah, I could believe that, or I don't really care what the truth is. And that's dangerous too. I think.
So, what causes us to be tricked into believing something that's not true?
If you say something enough times to someone, eventually they're going to start to believe it, especially if it's something that they didn't get to experience themselves. If you always hear a story from your parents about walking uphill both ways to school in 3 feet of snow, you're gonna, like, as a kid, you're gonna assume that that's like actually what they were doing, and not that, they had to walk 3 blocks, and maybe it rained once or twice. So I think if you say it enough, it just kind of gets ingrained in your brain.
Yeah. Or we even lie to ourselves. We can tell ourselves something and almost make it true for ourselves, which makes it more believable for other people. And then years down the line, it's like, oh, that actually never happened. That's one of the dangers of lying or telling yourself lies.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we just take a piece of something, and that's all we think about, talk about, and then we get tunnel vision and we forget the other pieces that go along with it. I was in a conversation yesterday that, in my opinion, was very unfortunate. From their perspective, they were determined to make their point, but for me, it was just very, very unfortunate, because I think there's going to be a price to it, a cost, not for that person personally, but for other people, because they're just taking a singular thing and making some big stink out of it. And I pointed out to them, like, you're missing some other pieces. We were talking about the Bible. You're missing some other pieces here that go along with this. But they were so determined. And I don't want to say they were deceived, because what they were saying was not wrong, but it was not the full picture, And I think that sometimes we get a piece of the information, and that's the piece of information that gets repeated over and over again to us. Churches are horrible for it. Denominations, they get on one, little bandwagon, and you miss all the rest of it, And I think that sometimes, if we're not careful, the inputs will be so limited that we won't hear the full truth, and we can be deceived because we're only getting a piece of the truth. There was a golden calf. There's no like that. There's no missing that piece. But that's only a part of the story, and it was a bad part of the story. It wasn't a good part of the story. And sometimes bad things can become good. Good things can become bad. And I just think it's a thing we always have to be guarded against,
Yeah. Well, here's even a little one. This is not a dangerous one, but a Mandela effect from the Bible. What do you think Delilah cut Samson's hair with? What do you think he cut her hair with? Or what do you think she cut his hair with?
I don't recall.
Get this. Delilah didn't cut his hair. It was a guard that cut his hair. Delilah let in the guard. I was trying to trick you into thinking it was like a scissors or something like that. But really, Delilah, we all think that Delilah cut his hair. That's what all the children's illustrations show. When you have the kids' Bibles, that's what it shows on there. But the Bible clearly says that she let a guard in and he was the one who cut her hair. But it's so crazy.
She couldn't get up to get the scissors because he was asleep in her lap.
Yeah, it's like you gotta be really quiet. But it's like
here's what I gotta say about Samson.
Yeah.
He was a heavy sleeper. Right? I mean, y'all read the story. I'm not talking about just cutting his hair. They came and weaved like what you know what I'm talking about?
The loom.
The looms in his hair while he's sleeping. Like how heavy does he have to sleep?
They even put those little things in between his fingers, and they painted his nails for him too while he was sleeping.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
No, but it's crazy. That's like a simple Mandela effect thing. And even though it is pretty harmless, because whether it was a guard that cut the hair or Delilah cutting the hair, it's not doesn't seem that big of a deal. However, that just goes to show as an example of like how easy it is for us to collectively almost like lie to ourselves or tell ourselves something because it just like, it makes more sense. It's Delilah cut his hair. She was the one there.
And just as a last note here, you need a sweatshirt that says Dad. You're giving mamas a bad name with your jokes. At least if it said Dad on it, they would know why your jokes were so lame.
Okay. I'll wear a terrible dad joke pun next time.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's wind this down. I hope that next week you'll join us as we talk about 2 Kings and some of the challenges and things that we learned from that book. Thank you for being a part of this today. Make sure you like, subscribe to our video, our channel, wherever you're listening to this at, so that you can get this each and every week.